Great. Why don't we begin then? So welcome and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to YPOers and friends around the world. I'm Dick Simon, co-founder and learning chair of the YPO President's Action Now Gold Chapter and founder and chair of the YPO Psychedelic Medicine for Mental Health group. I spend all of my time helping advance this work, both because of the incredible evidence and data for efficacy, addressing otherwise treatment-resistant or untreatable mental health issues, and on a personal level, having learned in our own family how difficult and intractable these problems are. The call will be 60 minutes with a question and answer session following my conversation. Following, Joseph's going to give a brief presentation, then we'll have some conversation between us, and then we will be taking your questions. If you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A feature on the Zoom screen, and we'll get to them during the Q&A session. Please note that the call is being recorded, and the recording link will be sent to all registrants in about 48 hours, which is a really good reason to be signing up for future calls, even if the live timing doesn't work for you. So we're incredibly honored and privileged to be joined today by Joseph Del Moral. Joseph's a serial entrepreneur and co-founder and CEO of Field Trip Health, which addresses mental health in several ways using psychedelics and psychedelic therapies. Prior to Field Trip, Joseph was working very successfully in cannabis, where he was the founder of Canvas RX and Canadian Cannabis Clinics. Field Trip Health is one of the 5 psychedelic-focused companies to list on public markets in the US. Joseph lives in Toronto with his wife, son, daughter, and their dog Lola. So, Joseph, I'll turn over to you. Welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Dick. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been in YPO for 5 years, so it's great to be able to do this and speak to my fellow YPOers. I'm excited.
Great. If you would like you like to do your presentation sort of as an overview of Field Trip, and then we'll go to conversation between us.
Let's do that. I'll share my screen here. Okay, like in psychedelic therapies, I think it's important to start with intentions, and so we started Field Trip. I have actually we're 5 co-founders who started Field Trip, so it's a bit of an unusual founding structure. But my partners and I from my previous business, in the medical cannabis space, decided we wanted to, first of all, after exiting that business and the roller coaster ride that is a startup, we were all still friends, which is what I'm proud of. And we wanted to continue working together. And so we started Field Trip, and with a vision to empower people to ease their suffering and live life with more joy, wonder, and fulfillment. And we knew, as you all know, that psychedelic therapy involves both a psychedelic drug, the molecule, plus psychedelic therapy, a large amount of therapy actually, before, during, and after these experiences. And so we wanted to focus on both of those things in Field Trip. And so that's how we structured the business. This is my corporate presentation. I'm going to zip through parts of it. The purpose of this is not really to get into all the corporate details, but to use it as a way to sort of bring up some of the points that I think are interesting and sort of stimulate some discussion later. In Field Trip, our main focus is developing what we call a next generation psychedelic compound. So as most of you know, MDMA and psilocybin are currently in phase 3 and phase 2 clinical trials. These are classic psychedelics, and the efficacy coming out of the clinical trials looks really promising. We saw an opportunity to improve upon some of the characteristics of those drugs and create something that might be preferred clinically. And so we developed what we call FT104. The goal of the point of FT104 is to create a drug that had a shorter duration of experience. So going from psilocybin, which might be 4 or 6 hours, or MDMA, which could be even longer, psychoactive experience time, down to what we think might be 2 to 3 hours with FT104, but still retaining a lot of the benefits of psilocybin, the known pharmacology of psilocybin. So we see on this graph, I'll just quickly scan through this, we we present psilocybin versus FT104, so showing that it's very similar to psilocybin pharmacologically, hits the same sort of receptors at approximately the same potency, but has a much shorter duration. One of the interesting things about working in psychedelics, especially in the drug development side of psychedelics, is that people have developed a lot of these molecules in the, call it, designer drug market. And so actually, FT104 is a prodrug. The active species that is at the base of the prodrug is actually a known psychedelic, which has some limited human experience use on it. So we've actually been able to speak to people who've taken FT104, not FT104, the active underneath FT104, which we're not disclosing yet, and be able to talk to them about their experience. And so it's a kind of an interesting position to be in as a drug developer, to be able to speak to people who've taken a compound very similar to the one that you're developing. And that's a theme that you'll see across the psychedelic space. Here we're just comparing PK profile, so expected time of activity for FT104 in red and psilocybin in blue. So what we're showing here is that we hope to create a drug that can create a much faster time to peak experience, which is when people have the psychedelic experience, many of the benefits are achieved, and then a faster elimination, which makes for a shorter overall time that the patient has to be in the specialized clinical setting with support. Let me just go through this pretty quickly here. There are many conditions that could potentially be addressed with psychedelics. We did a long process to sort of come up with the ones that fit scientifically, had a good clinical development path, and a good commercial opportunity and strategic fit. The two indications that we are pursuing for FT104 are treatment-resistant depression and postpartum depression. The treatment-resistant depression is probably the most common indication that's going to be pursued in the space, mainly because of the size of the addressable market. It is a long path to clinical approval with large trials. Postpartum depression is sort of an innovative one for us. We're very excited about it. We think that this profile of drug that works very quickly, washes out very quickly, could be really helpful to new mothers who suffer from postpartum depression. There's only one drug on the market, and it requires a 60-hour long infusion in a specialized setting. So being able to help these mothers in a few hours and then get back to their babies is an interesting area of opportunity. Also with a much shorter development timeline of about 5 years versus 7 years. I'll talk a little bit about the aspect of field trip that most people hear about when they think about field trip in the media or in the news, is that we have actually two parts. The second part is the clinic network, where we have currently 8 clinics delivering psychedelic assisted psychotherapy across North America, and 1 clinic in the Netherlands delivering psilocybin assisted psychotherapy. The goal of these clinics is really twofold. First, to de-risk the path to approval for FT104 and our future pipeline drugs. And we can do that by taking the insights and learnings that we get from actually treating patients right now with ketamine. So we use ketamine as the psychedelic drug in our clinics in North America. And we do ketamine assisted psychotherapy. So it's a tightly bound program of ketamine plus psychotherapy over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. And the insights we can generate from delivering those types of experiences with patients at scale can then go in to helping develop or plan our phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. And so the goal is to use that to help de-risk the path to approval for our drugs. And then after approval, we've seen from other drugs that require administration in a specialized setting, is that you're not guaranteed to be successful just because you get approved. You also have to start working on the commercialization aspects of it. And especially with psychedelics, I think that's a major area which needs to be developed. These are drugs that will, for the most part, be delivered in specialized settings with psychotherapy support. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that's needed to build out the infrastructure to allow these types of therapies to be delivered at scale, as well as the technology that will support the patient journeys in centers like ours, but also in other centers that want to deliver these types of therapies. And so I see the clinics as providing a second strategic benefit, that they will help de-risk the commercialization of these types of therapies by helping us engage with payers across the different payers across the United States and Canada, to start understanding their needs and what they want to see to get coverage, allow us to start developing provider and referral networks, establishing the reputation and brand of the clinics, and really helping to figure out, how do you deliver a drug plus therapy in a way that's scalable and sustainable. There's really, nobody's done this at scale before. We're planning to scale to 75 locations by the end of 2024. And I've talked about that. I'll just present some of our new data, which I think is interesting, about the benefits of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So we know that ketamine is an antidepressant on its own. So it's not surprising that when somebody gets a course of ketamine over 3 to 4 weeks, their depression will drop. What we're seeing on the graph on the left is patient data from our first cohorts of patients to go through mostly our Toronto clinic. You see a significant improvement in depression scores. The drop from day 0 to day 30 when they end their program with us is significant. What you'd expect to see if it was just ketamine on its own is you'd expect to see a quick sort of rebound back to baseline over the course of some number of weeks. What we're seeing in our patients is that it bounces up a little bit, still in the mild zone at day 60, and then at day 120 stays relatively the same as day 60. So we're excited about this early data. It's still very, very early. We're excited about the signals we're getting that the combination of ketamine plus therapy seems to be creating these longer lasting effects. And so that's an area that we're continuing to collect data on and look at. The graph on the right is the same data for anxiety. One of the interesting things that we can do right now is actually treat people with psilocybin in the form of legal psilocybin containing truffles in Amsterdam, where we have a clinic, and we started that about 6 weeks ago. So that's exciting for us as a drug developer, because our drug is a 5-HT2A receptor agonist, just like psilocybin is. So a lot of the insights that we can generate from the data that we're collecting at our Netherlands clinics sort of is more directly applicable to what we're doing with FT104. And also the work is just really important. I mean, the patients that come see us in the Netherlands are reporting tremendous benefits and outcomes. It's too early for us to talk about the data that we're collecting there, but we're having really positive first experiences there. And I'll skip all that and hand it back over to Dick.
Great. Thanks. So you're doing a lot. There are a number of general things I wanted to talk about, but just a couple of specific questions. Are you seeing different responses? What is the patient experience like using ketamine-assisted psychotherapy versus what you're finding out in these early weeks in Amsterdam using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy?
So at the moment, we're seeing more similarities than differences. So what both of them offer is a very rapid onset, very rapid sort of benefits to the patient. So, they're seeing benefits that same day as the dose or the next day. So that's the same with both ketamine and psilocybin. Where we expect to see differences is in the longer term data. Psilocybin seems to create longer lasting changes when it's paired properly with psychotherapy, like we're doing in the Netherlands. And so what we expect to see is sort of a sustained improvement that lasts longer than what you'd see with ketamine.
Okay, great. Something just struck me. It's minor, but I was just trying to understand it, and others may have a similar question. When you're looking at postpartum versus treatment-resistant depression, you're projecting a shorter timeline to approval, whereas one might think that because you're dealing with new mothers who are likely nursing, that actually the approval process might be more complicated. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so we're fortunate that there's a regulatory pathway that's been set out. So Sage developed, it's the only approved drug in postpartum depression, Zulresso. So we sort of we're able to base our regulatory and clinical development plan off of the trials that were approved by the FDA for them. And so, yeah, they do require smaller numbers of participants. The endpoints are actually shorter. So you're looking at endpoints that you're measuring at 7 or 14 days versus in TRD, or you can be measuring months, endpoints months out. And so it just makes for shorter trial. Your phase 2 and phase 3 trials are shorter and require less participants. And so, it's shorter and less costly to get to market. Obviously, the market size is much smaller, but there's a huge sort of unmet need here, and it's exciting. I think we have a pretty good chance of being the first novel psychedelic drug to be in market if we get approval, for going after a pretty fast pathway to approval. So that pathway starts next in the first quarter of next year with our phase 1 trial, which we're actually doing in the Netherlands. Just happens that our CRO has a phase 1 site in the Netherlands, but also in a phase 1 trial, with psychedelics, you typically want to be having study participants who have experience with psychoactive drugs. You don't want to give people their first psychedelic experience in that clinical trial. And luckily, in the Netherlands, where psilocybin is legal, there's a fairly large healthy volunteer population to do that.
Great. So, can you give a sense? How did you get involved in all this? What's similar to cannabis, different from cannabis? What brings you here today?
Yeah, so actually my YPO qualifying business was Cannabis RX, which was a medical cannabis clinic company in Canada. We grew it we had 30 clinics across the country. We saw 150,000 patients. We were the first and by far the largest in the country source of medical cannabis patients to the producers of cannabis in Canada. And so we exited that company. We sold that company to Aurora and stayed on for a couple of years to hit our earnout milestones there. And when we left in mid 2018, we'd sort of been hearing about psychedelics, but to be honest, we'd been so busy for 5 years in cannabis that we were just putting our heads up for the first time, and finally had time to actually sort of understand what was going on. And we spent a lot of time. We spent 8 or 9 months speaking to everybody we could in the space, which was, in 2018, quite a bit smaller than it is today. So that was pretty easy, actually, to pick up the phone and speak to everybody. And what we sort of realized over those months was the data coming out of the clinical trials was just, really game changing. So astounding at levels of efficacy and duration. And that if those results continued, it was clearly going to change the way we treat mental health conditions in the future. And that was just personally exciting to me and to my co-founders. And so we said, all right, well, how do we get involved in this? We didn't have a background in drug development. So although we saw the opportunity, it was sort of hard to imagine how to approach it. We had just exited a clinics business. So the clinic side of things was kind of a relatively straightforward for us to work on. So the first thing we did was go out and find the best people we could. So we brought on Mike Ehlers, who's the head of R&D at Biogen until he left over a year ago now, to join us as an advisor. And he confirmed our general thesis was that there is a white space scientifically, IP wise and commercially to develop new compounds. And so when someone like that sort of confirmed it, that led us to say, all right, well, let's go and find the best chief science officer we can. So we brought on Nathan Bryson, who joined our team in the early days, and built out a team to sort of evaluating opportunities and finding molecules that we could start developing. And they did an amazing job synthesizing a bunch of different families of drugs, and one thing led to another. And so now we're sort of starting phase 1 in next quarter in FT104. But back to sort of your original question, the the impetus for our partners, and one of the things that my partners and I learned in the medical cannabis space, especially in Canada, medical cannabis is really, people are very sick when they come to a medical cannabis clinic. They have to be referred by a doctor. They have to have tried other treatments. And these are people who are suffering and not having relief in other ways. And if you went to any of the waiting rooms at any of our clinics, you'd see those people. And then to hear their stories and the benefit that they had after, working with our doctors and trying medical cannabis in an appropriate and medically supervised way, was just, it was so touching and important to us. It became table stakes to us in any other venture we were going to do, that we wanted to be able to, we call it depth and breadth. So we wanted to help people as much as we could, as deeply as we could on an individual basis, but to be able to set up the structure so that we could do it in a way that really scales sustainably. And so that was our goal going in, is, if these drugs have so much promise, we have a skill set that we think can help get them out there at scale. So we want to do that and create the best possible experiences for patients at huge scale. And so, yeah, that's really hard to do, but that's what we're working on. And we haven't sort of cracked the nut definitely completely, but we're working on it.
Great. So let's talk for a moment about the clinics. What you're doing in terms of scaling right now, the ketamine assisted clinics, is really hard. You have the experience. And I guess, could you talk just a bit about how your clinics differ from other clinics that are being set up, and how you sort of think about that? And I'm referring to other clinics that are doing assisted therapy as opposed to strictly infusion.
Right. Well, that's the sort of first distinction, which I'm glad you made, that, the majority of ketamine clinics out there are strictly doing infusions, not really providing much psychotherapy. There are a number of other clinics doing ketamine assisted psychotherapy, and each of them have their own protocols and plans and how they do it. There's even some companies doing ketamine at home, which can be appropriate and helpful for some people who can't get into the clinic. So there's a number of ways this is being delivered. What we decided to focus on strategically for us is thinking that, ketamine for us is kind of the first step, but we know that MDMA is likely to be approved sometime in 2023, and we hope psilocybin will be approved a year or two after that. And so we want our clinics to be at the center for psychedelic experiences in each city. And so we've designed our program and our infrastructure to work with that. So we worked with some of the sort of leading psychologists in the space to create a custom protocol for pairing with ketamine. And so we use standard tools that psychotherapists have. So one is called behavioral activation, another one's called motivational interviewing, and sort of paired it in a protocol, put it in a protocol that takes advantage of the psychedelic experience and the insights that you can get out of a psychedelic experience, as well as the neuroplasticity and sort of openness period that happens after a psychedelic experience. So, our staff are trained in delivering that protocol in a way that sort of, we hope, maximizes outcomes. The second sort of big piece that we've done, I think in advance of most others, is really focus on the technology that supports the patient journey. So all of our patients get onboarded onto our a digital platform that really focuses on some of the important things that you have to have when you do a psychedelic experience, which we all know, preparation, intention setting, all that sort of work that has to happen before. We explain what that is. Most of our patients have never had a psychedelic experience before. So we're explaining the theory of what's behind psychedelic experiences and why we think they can be so impactful. So there's a lot of education piece in there. And then they come in to do the dosing with us. We're supporting them with a psychotherapist. And then when they go home, there's more work for them to do. There's journaling functions, there's exercises. There's also communication with therapists if they want it. There's video and chat communication. So we support the patient closely sort of all the way through the 3 to 4 weeks. And that's one of the reasons I think we're seeing these sort of really good results that seem to be lasting longer, because we're really sort of intensively working with them over that period.
And what sort of background or training do your therapists have?
they're all licensed therapists. And one of the benefits of sort of being seen as one of the leaders in the space is that we've been able to attract some of the really just top-notch therapists. I think it's one of our sort of hidden superpowers is just the incredible staff that we've been able to attract. Such passionate people who are devoted to getting psychedelic therapy out there and doing it in the way to really maximize patient outcomes. And so we have lots of graduates from CIIS. Which is the California Institute for Integral Studies, which is a well-regarded psychedelic therapy training program, as well as a number of other psychedelic therapy training programs. They come into us, and then we have a week-long training program for all of the staff to go through to learn our protocols. So we've been fortunate to be able to attract many people with really good experience.
Great. And roughly, what is the cost per patient?
It's about $5,000. That includes the 10 sessions. It's about 10 sessions, so 6 dosing sessions plus 4 psychotherapy sessions. And one of the challenges we face as an industry is around reimbursement. So ketamine, the ketamine itself is really not often reimbursed by most plans. Patients are getting some reimbursement around the psychotherapy portions of the bill, depending on their plan. But it is one of the challenging areas to get sort of proper reimbursement in here. And so that's one of the things that we're focused on, and we're happy to sort of work with others on, is really educating payers about the benefits of these types of therapies and how you can create really long-lasting, deeply impactful changes that can really change people's lives in a meaningful way, and sort of, we hope, reduce sort of ongoing need for different healthcare services going forward. So one of the sort of low-hanging fruits there is around short-term disability, that large employers have a number of employees on short-term disability. The largest single bucket of those is mental health reasons. And so if we can, as an industry, start looking at that bucket of people and say, all right, well, we can get these people back to work with one intervention, that's a really positive ROI, easily positive ROI initiative. And I think it'd be the way sort of we start getting more buy-in from some of the employers and healthcare payers.
Yeah, I know others are also looking at comorbidities. If you're dealing with severely diabetic patients and can change behavioral patterns that can, because third-party payers tend to look at it. Yeah, mental health is like a piece of their cost, but it's generally a relatively small piece. But if you can, help with the more expensive pieces, it's less of a battle and more of a collaboration.
Absolutely.
So I've got many more questions to discuss, but I'll interweave these, if you will, or intersperse these with questions that are coming in from others. And again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button, and we'll try to get to all that we can. So in some of these, you are obviously coming from individuals who have a specific need or question, but love the answer to that as well as more broadly. Are psychedelic therapies appropriate for an 18-year-old teen with severe OCD?
That's a good question. I'm not going to really be able to comment too much on that one. I'm not a physician. I'm not a clinician. What I can say is that we know that the brain development continues until about age 25, and so I think there are some concerns around using psychedelics for that age group, and so that's definitely one to speak to a physician about. So sorry, I can't sort of give a better answer than that.
What's the youngest age that you will see patients?
18 is the youngest age we'll see patients, but it's at the doctor's discretion. And so, I don't know the numbers of 18-year-olds, but I think it's very low, the number of 18-year-old patients that we've treated in our clinics.
Got it. All right. Next is, because you're looking for faster acting processes, are you planning research on DMT, or more specifically probably 5-MeO DMT, which is very fast acting?
Yeah, those are very interesting compounds. I think they have promise. one of the screens that we used in deciding which compounds we wanted to look at was around intellectual property, availability of intellectual property. So those are known compounds. It's going to be very challenging to build a robust sort of IP strategy around them. And to get these drugs all the way to market is, as you know, clinical trials extremely expensive. We're going to need to have, I think, good intellectual property, good commercial potential in the future to attract the capital needed to fund the trials to get them all the way through approval. So that's the reason we sort of haven't gone down the path of sort of looking at molecules that are known compounds. The second thing is that although they can create very short experiences, they also are very intense experiences often. And so, I think there is a sweet spot in terms of, having an experience that's long enough and sort of gentle enough that it doesn't induce anxiety, that it sort of allows the patient to have some of the really powerful introspective thoughts that come about with psychedelics. So we're actually pretty comfortable that the sort of 2-hour range is enough time to allow a person to sort of ramp up to a peak experience, come down, and still have enough time to have those types of insights and thoughts that can really benefit patients during a psychedelic experience. So we're happy with this, with the time we found. Not to say there's not potential in shorter duration molecules. I think there may be, but they have their own sets of challenges.
Okay. Thank you. I guess in terms of dosage that you are building on that question, in terms of dosages that you are using, are you creating, how much of an ego dissolution experience are your patients experiencing? Or are you keeping them lucid to the point of carrying on conversations with the therapist during the session? Or is there a period of both?
So it's an arc. So we prepare the patients beforehand, then we give them the ketamine injection. The dosage sort of can vary by patient. It's at the clinician's and patient's discretion in terms of where they want the dose to go over the 6 doses. And during the peak part of the experience, the vast majority of patients are not speaking. They've got an eye mask on, they've got sound canceling, noise canceling headphones, or listening to a psychedelic music playlist, and they're sort of going internally and thinking through the issues that they came in to think about. That's why we focus so much on intention setting before these sessions. So they're generating those types of insights and thoughts that then, as they sort of come out of the experience, and ketamine is usually about an hour long, they take off their eye mask, they take off their headphones, and then the therapist is there in the room with them to sort of talk about the experience that they had and sort of gather any pieces of information or insights that they want to then incorporate into the psychotherapy sessions, the integration sessions that happen afterwards.
Another question, you mentioned one molecule that you are working on. Are there others, or are you primarily focused from a drug development standpoint, because it's expensive and a major process to go through?
We've only announced one molecule, but we have announced that we are working on pipeline candidates.
Yeah.
Nothing to announce today, but it's definitely an area that we're our discovery function is working hard on that. Great.
Thanks. There are a few questions related to Prop 109 in Oregon, which creates, for those who are not familiar with it, an alternative to traditional medical distribution systems. It's a ballot initiative that has a 2-year phase in, and we're about almost at 1 year of it. The questions are along the lines like, how are you thinking about the Oregon legalization, even of LSD in your strategy? They meant psilocybin, I'm sure, but oh, sorry, that's a different question. That's asking about the decriminalization, which is a separate. We'll go to that one in a moment. But Prop 109 is clearing a pathway for those who are not diagnosed with mental illnesses to participate in treatment. Will so-called healthy normals be able to access your psilocybin treatments?
So I'll start by saying that we've been fully supportive of the legalization efforts in Oregon for psilocybin. I think they're approaching it in the right way. So for those who don't know, they're proposing a structure where anybody who's over, I think it's age of 19, can and has no contraindications can access psilocybin in the state of Oregon through by buying it through a licensed grower and a licensed and with licensed administration in a specialized site. So I think that's the responsible way, at least for now, to sort of get this market opened and get access to people for psilocybin. I like the fact that it's not purely medical. Like, you don't have to have a prescription to access it. Healthy people will be able to access it if they want to just have a consciousness expanding experience. And so we've been supportive of the measure. We're one of the, I think, only 2 or very few corporate donors to support that initiative. We've got good relationships there and continue to be supportive of them. We haven't, we're looking at opportunities there as a company. That does become more complicated as a NASDAQ listed company to be participating in activities that are state legal, but federally still illegal. And so that's one of the challenges we have with this sort of, state versus federal legality issue as a publicly traded company.
So broadening that question then, how are you thinking about, both Oregon's broad decriminalization and other, which you should explain, if you would, the difference between decrim and what one does, but and a lot of other municipalities and increasingly states are looking at, and how that will impact the overall business.
Sure. Let me start with decriminalization versus legalization. Decriminalization instructs the police force, the law enforcement agencies to make criminalizing, arresting people with in this case psilocybin or other psychedelic drugs the lowest priority. So it doesn't actually make it legal, just makes it very unlikely that somebody will be charged with an offense. And so our preferred course is legalization. Legalization creates a legal framework and regulations that allow people to access these types of compounds legally, and creates the framework that allows companies and or different organizations to start operating in a way that can ensure sort of safety, testing, proper regulations that will ensure sort of the smoother rollout of these types of therapies. So we've always been supportive of legalization efforts. Now, personally speaking, I support decriminalization. I think it's the right thing to do. I think the war on drugs is a complete failure. But if I had to choose, I'd choose the legalization path over the decriminalization path. Just I think it creates a better system with better and safer access for people.
What are you worried about in the space?
That's a good question. There's, I think that there's a risk of sort of too much hype around the space in the capital markets side of things. I think there's been, especially in Canada, an explosion of publicly traded companies all sort of seeking to do more or less the same thing. And so, I think there's a risk of there being some negative outcomes as a result of just, the overabundance of companies sort of pursuing similar objectives with sort of often not really sort of well-developed business plans and sort of taking advantage of investor excitement in the space. In terms of the therapies and drugs themselves, I think one of the risks that as an industry, I think we're trying to mitigate this time around is sort of letting the drugs sort of be used in an irresponsible way that creates sort of negative perceived experiences for people out there. So sort of the what happened in the 60s, where sort of LSD escaped from the lab and became a huge countercultural phenomenon. also directly led to the backlash against it from some of the sort of more conservative parts of society. And so we want to make sure that this time around we're sort of rolling this out in a way that's responsible, starting medically with FDA approved molecules, and in a way that will long term be accepted for the useful medicines they are.
So how does that tie into your earlier comment about decriminalization being the right thing to do and legalization being even better? Are there any concerns there that that's taken out of the lab?
Yeah. So I think that in Oregon, they're doing it in a way that is responsible with you need to have a licensed administrator, so a trained person, the details of which are still being developed by the authorities in Oregon, but a trained person who will guide and help the patient or the client going through the experience. And I think that's key. What we've learned is that set and setting is critical to having these positive types of outcomes and positive experiences. And so I think if it's done the right way, legalization can definitely work well. I personally, I'm not sure I want to see a dispensary type of open market as the first step in this sort of broadening access of psychedelics. I think the way Oregon's doing it is wise. Eventually, will we get there? Yeah, I think so. As society sort of gets to understand how powerful these molecules are and how to use them in the right way, I think we can get there. But I think it's a stepwise type of approach.
In terms of setting, a question has come in. Have you experimented with individualized music playlists, and do you think different playlists have different results on the client?
That's one of the really interesting questions. If you speak to our clients, or really anybody who's had a psychedelic experience, they'll tell you how important the music was to their experience. And there's really not a lot of science right now to support that music is really important to the experience, or yes or no, or more specifically, is one type of music better than another type of music? That's just not known. But there's so much interest in that, in the music part of this experience from the people who go through it, that it's definitely one of the areas that as a company we're looking at closely. We've done some work in the past with Wave Paths, which is a really interesting startup that does generative music for psychedelic experiences, where the therapists actually have some degree of control about the sort of arc of the music and helping to guide patients with that. So that's interesting. There are a number of other startups who work with Lucid. In our app, we have an app for guiding consciousness expanding experiences called Trip, and we've worked with a company called Lucid to generate music for that. So there are a number of really interesting startups working in the space. Not much to say in terms of like the evidence there yet, but it is an area that I think deserves more attention and science.
Interesting. So can you explain to people sort of what route of administration you're using for ketamine, in terms of IV, IM, lozenge, or orally, and what those differences mean?
Mm-hmm. We actually use both lozenge and intramuscular injections. In Toronto, because of the regulations in Ontario, we use lozenges, and with a rapid dissolve tablet, it works very well. The sort of main difference between that and intramuscular injection is the onset time is a little bit faster with an intramuscular injection. You can, if you think of IV versus intramuscular injection, you can think of it as, IV gives you a constant dose. You're looking at kind of a square wave type of profile, whereas intramuscular will give you a sort of a bigger arc. So you'll have, and that's, one of the reasons that we use intramuscular injection is we want to create that arc, that we think that arc is important to the experience for the patient. It helps them sort of create that psychedelic experience that we try to create. So, we're very unlike some of the companies out there that are trying to avoid the psychedelic aspect of psychedelic drugs or trying to remove hallucinations, all that sort of thing. We're fully leaning into the psychedelic experience. We want to create, powerful psychedelic experiences for our patients.
Great. What kind of market demand are you seeing at your clinics? Are you at wait lists, or are you more breaking into the market and it's not quite full yet? And you've got a very aggressive growth plan, ambition.
Yeah. It depends on the clinic and where they are in their ramping phase. So we estimate that it takes about 15 to 18 months for a clinic to break even from when we start dosing patients. And during that time, we ramp up slowly as we sort of expand the number of therapists, the trained therapists at each site, as we expand the referral network in each clinic, as the number of, as the city gets to know that we exist and demand increases, we sort of in lockstep increase the number of therapists. And we have typically 6 to 8 dosing rooms per clinic. And so, operating at full capacity, we'll have the same number of therapists in the clinic seeing patients. And we usually have a nurse practitioner who does the dosing of the patients. And so at our oldest clinics, or Toronto and New York are our 2 oldest clinics, we have, very robust demand. We've added evening and weekend hours. At our newer clinics, we're still in the process of sort of getting the word out and ramping up.
So ketamine is an interesting, there are a lot of interesting perceptions around ketamine. Some of them negative, some of them positive. Among many who were involved with psychedelics, it's viewed as an interim step until. What's your perspective and any comments on that?
Mm. What I can say is, some people will say, "Oh, ketamine's not really a psychedelic." What I can say is that if you ask the majority of our patients, they'll tell you they had an intense psychedelic experience. We know that, for many of our patients, it's creating these really powerful psychedelic experiences. So that's really not a question to them. The question is, did it work? And what we know is that, ketamine on its own works as an antidepressant, even if you had no therapy, even if you had no psychedelic experience. And so the leaning into, getting that psychedelic experience, pairing it properly with psychotherapy, it really helps to, I think, add to that overall experience and hopefully outcomes for the patients. But in a way, they're also right. It is a step that we can do right now and start developing the protocols and the experience and the clinical infrastructure and the technology and everything that needs to be developed so that when MDMA becomes available, we're ready for it. I think demand and interest will skyrocket when we have MDMA and psilocybin available to treat patients with as well. And so, we plan to be ready for that and use ketamine right now to help us build out the infrastructure to allow us to help as many people as we can once those drugs become available. And we'll always offer ketamine as well. It's it creates powerful experiences for people. It's a shorter duration. It's clinically easy to use in a setting where you want to turn over and maximize sort of the throughput through the clinics. So it's a useful drug, and I think it'll continue to see a fair amount of use. And that decision of which drug to use once we have other options is ultimately with the doctor, right? The doctor, the clinician will be matching the patient's condition with the drug, based on the indication, often, in practice based on insurance coverage and what's getting covered, and what's going to lead to the best outcomes for the patient.
So, what is your perspective on what will happen to this space more broadly over the next 4 or 5 years? I mean, if you look backward, the space didn't even exist a few years ago,
Right.
And now, there's a tremendous amount of activity, and it seems like it continues to grow and expand based on our promise.
I think this is a really, I think this will change the way we treat a large number of chronic mental health conditions. I think this will become the accepted, psychedelic therapies will become the accepted sort of best in class treatment for many of these conditions. And like I was saying before, I think if you're looking sort of 10 years in the future, when there are a number of different options available in terms of the drugs, I think you'll see a future where a clinician will work with a patient, fully understand that patient, like what's their condition, what's their medical history, everything about that patient, and then match them with the molecule and with a therapy protocol. And so that combination of the patient, the molecule, and the therapeutic protocol in the right setting, I think can be very, very powerful. And so I think, if you're looking out 10 years, I think that's what it starts to look like. And that's really exciting to me.
Yeah. Other than, potential issues of it getting out of the lab, after, seeing a repeat of the 60s in terms of the outcome of that repeat, what else do you get concerned about in this space? I mean, you drew a very positive, 5 to 10 year vision. What keeps you up at night?
That's a good question. What the real answer, what keeps me up at night is all of the sort of operational struggles that come with scaling a fast growing startup. I'm not, I sleep well at night thinking about the future and the potential for psychedelics and therapies and the ability to create these amazing outcomes. I'm not losing sleep over that. I lose sleep over all the other things that every other entrepreneur loses sleep over. The challenges of scaling a very fast growing startup in a space that's growing tremendously quickly, where the rule books aren't written yet. So there's a lot of things that keep me up at night, but that's really not one of them.
So it's less the future of psychedelics than the lease on the next property that you're doing, and the landlord that's holding firm on some term that's problematic.
Yeah, you read my mind.
Yeah. Great. So what is the best way that you would resource for people who are interested in diving deeper about ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, other than visiting your clinics, which obviously would be a way of doing that? But how would you suggest people learn more?
There isn't sort of one sort of textbook or one sort of leading book that I can point people to, or one resource that's sort of recognized as the leader in the space. So if you're really interested, you can sign up for some of the training courses. Those are mostly used by clinicians. There's a number now, often offered over weekends. So that's if you want to dive deep. If you want to just sort of understand the space more, you can look at some of the clinical trials that have been done with ketamine. Some really interesting results there. And obviously, anybody in YPO should feel free to reach out to me, and I can point them to a whole bunch of resources and studies and trials, and happy to speak to anybody.
Sure. On trials, a question, because I've been involved in trying to make this happen, but are there trials that you can point to that indicate, peer-reviewed ketamine-assisted psychotherapy's efficacy?
No, there are no good peer-reviewed studies on that yet. So that's one of the areas that we're looking to work on and use some of our data for. We do have a couple of research initiatives underway internally, but there are no good studies yet showing the difference between pairing psychotherapy with ketamine versus not having the psychotherapy.
Yeah. We can follow up after. I've been involved with some groups that are looking to do something like that. What do you want to make sure people walk away from this with? If you had like 3 or 4 key messages as we move to the top of the hour here, that you really want to make sure that, all right, don't forget X, Y, and Z.
So if you're looking at, depends what lens you're viewing this through. If you're looking at this, as a patient, I would say, there's tremendous promise here. There are treatments that are available right now that are replicating some of the sort of mechanisms of action that we think are happening with psychedelics. So with ketamine, with psilocybin assisted therapy in the Netherlands and other legal jurisdictions, there are starting to be options available, and the future is really bright with MDMA, psilocybin, FD104, and other drugs that come down the market. If you're looking at this as an investor or somebody who's interested in the space, commercially, I'd say to pay attention to intellectual property. I think intellectual property on these molecules is an area that has to be looked at very carefully. There is tremendous promise for some of the early movers like Compass and others that are advancing the classic psychedelics. But there are also challenges, and I think it's important to get educated on that aspect of the space. So I think that is going to be one of the key sort of differentiators between the different groups over the next few years.
So just expanding on that for a moment, there are questions or controversy or whatever around some of the around patents. Do you have any comment that you would make on that? I mean, you sort of embedded it earlier, but
it sort of depends what exactly you're talking about patenting. I know that some of the groups that are very active in the space got into a little bit of a controversy over trying to patent aspects around the therapy surrounding psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, or patenting different types of having different soft furniture in a therapy room, things like that are obviously going to be controversial, and I think there's really no space for that kind of thing in this industry as we're trying to get it off the ground. But if you're looking at IP protection around molecules, I think that's a well-established way to sort of create the right economic incentives that allow these very high-risk drug development activities to get financed and take place. And so, I think that's an important distinction there.
Great. Well, we're as we are at the end of our time together, I just wanted to invite people who wanted to please email me or just respond to the emails that you've been getting. If you have questions or you'd like to know more about Joseph's work or to get connected or whatever. And before concluding our call, I'd like to invite you, if you're a YPO member or spouse and interested in staying informed and learning more on all these topics, please join, if you're not already a member, the YPO Psychedelic Medicines for Mental Health group for discussion boards and ongoing GCCs. So I'll be in touch about our next program, and the details are still being finalized, but I really want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a special thanks to you, Joseph, for sharing your time, expertise, and the great work you are doing. So thank you on that. And as a final reminder, the recording of the GCC will be available and circulated to everyone within the next couple of days. So Joseph, thanks so much.
Thank you, Dick. Thanks for everything you do. It's a pleasure, and I'll just extend the invite if anybody feels like they want to reach out and chat. I'm happy to do that anytime.
Great. All right. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much. Take care. Goodbye, everybody. Have great days.